And hopefully there will be a more systematic approach, which this is more in the European Commission intentions, of course, given the Green Deal idea and its current attempts to implementation. And so they should think more about AI and more generally about ICT from that perspective.
Thank you. Pietro has a question, if I'm correct.
Thank you, Guillermo. I have just a question. Did you include also the cryptocurrency footprint inside the AI concept? I mean, the production of value through this automatic system of production, or is something that is not assessed anyway?
Okay, no, I did not include it because there is not a special AI role there. The Bitcoin and the other algorithms are extremely energy consuming, possibly more than the current AI total, not global, otherwise I introduce a confusion. Total carbon footprint. Of course, AI must be recognized as a special source within a broader context. So that definitely is another thing. I've certainly have not been exhaustive in terms of the examples I made, but the idea of global. It's noon here. Do you hear the bells? No, no.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Oh. And so there are possibly more global issues that are maybe interesting for the Aurora project to be included concerning the AI agenda. And
probably we can be more exhaustive in a future course on artificial intelligence and ethics.
So I just
Guillermo, thank you very much. Let us move to the next speaker. Now the bell sounds. That will be Tina van der Linden. We now move from AI and ethics to AI and law. And Tina van der Linden is from the law faculty. She did her PhD on legal expert systems, so law and AI already in the 90s. And she is an assistant professor in law, focusing on technology. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Am I audible and visible? Yeah, I think now, right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you for your invitation. Thank you for having me here on this research conference. I would like to. There was a big echo here. So, I would like to present a paper that I'm working on, a research paper that I'm in the process of writing. So this is really ongoing stuff that I'm working on. Hans, you do my slides, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so first, or the second slide, title slide, and then the next. We know from experience that there are many examples of harmful use of AI. I mean, right from the start, we have this computer says no experience that we all have had at some point, I think. You try to get coffee from the coffee machine, it doesn't work. You try to get into a building, it doesn't work. You apply for a loan, and you are rejected. Why? Nobody knows. Computer says no. There is also the issue of biases when you use artificial intelligence or computer systems for making decisions on people. And there are famous quoted by Matthew O'Neill of teachers who are assessed in some way, and then they are. Oh, we lost. We didn't. Yeah, the people online.
But we can hear you, Tina.
Yes, go ahead.
We can hear, I suppose. Yeah. Okay. Shall I continue or start again?
Yes, continue.
Continue. Okay. So I was talking about biases. It may be that if you use AI to decide on people, then any existing biases like inequality between men and women or racial inequalities will simply be continued by the AI system, because that is what it learns. Another big issue is the intransparency of AI systems. There is an outcome, an output, but nobody knows why this particular output was reached for this particular case. And if you talk about decisions that have a legal effect on people, you want to be able to explain why was this loan refused to you, why are you not admitted to something, etc. And in a broader sense, we could maybe even say that human rights are jeopardized. Like the right to equal treatment, like freedom of speech, I'll come back to that, and like access to justice, because you want to be able to challenge a decision that affects you. At the same time, there is of course the fear of missing out on advantages of technological development. I mean, you could say, okay, we will not use these computers then, but yeah, that is not really helpful, because they may offer significant advantages, both in terms of efficiency, but also possibly in terms of fairness. So just saying, okay, we're not going to do it. European Union regulation, and that contains a very, very broad definition of AI, basically covering almost all software. Right? You could even argue that a simple calculator is already artificial intelligence by the definition. But when you think of it, there is already a lot of regulation in place covering use of AI. If we go to the next slide, in law, then I don't have to look at my words. I assume that not all of you are lawyers. So basically in law, we distinguish between different fields of law. So for example, you can make a distinction between public law. Public law is about the relation between basically government institutions and citizens. Private law is between citizens and themselves. And so if I open a Facebook account, that action will be covered by private law because Facebook is a corporation. If I apply for a driver's license or take the train, then well, the train is a bit of an in-between example, but any business that I do with government, be it central government or government on a lower level, will be covered by law. There is already a lot of regulation in place covering public law on the use of AI. Next slide, please. Oops. Yes, there we are. Of course, if you want to decide on citizens, decide in individual cases, you will need to process personal information, personal data. And that is covered by the General Data Protection Regulation, very well known, I think also among the non-lawyers among us. And the GDPR has some very specific rules on non-personal data you can collect, our personal data, and how you collect it. So in particular, we have things like purpose limitation and minimization. You can only ask for data that you actually use. And the data subject, which is the person who this personal data refers to, has certain rights, like the right to be forgotten, that is best known. If you look at the application of the GDPR to use of AI or information technology in the public sphere, there are a few issues. Like it's often hidden from view, right? You don't know what data is collected about you, what it's used for, and well, if you don't know, what can you do? Another important point is that harmful profiles that may lead to unequal treatment or unfair decisions. Harmful profiles can be made with anonymized data. And then it may be the case that my data is compared to a profile, like the profile of a fraudster. And then, if there is a match, I can be assumed to commit fraud as well. And that is not necessarily a violation of the GDPR, depending on how this is done. There is also rules already in place governing decision making using information technology, and that is administrative law, of course, that decisions have to be adequately motivated, that they have to be fair, that all relevant considerations need to be taken into account by the government agency taking the decision, etc. There is, of course, non-discrimination law. You cannot, may not, should not distinguish between citizens on the basis of the grounds that are explicitly mentioned in the first article of our Constitution, except for certain exceptions, of course. But typically, gender, race, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, those kind of things. And there is, of course, fundamental rights, right, that are in the Constitution, but also in the European Convention of Human Rights. Like Cathy O'Neill, who I mentioned before, has emphasized, in the public sphere, we need to sacrifice accuracy and efficiency for fairness. Yeah? That is the big challenge. And recently, I discovered, or I realized, that in some sense generalization is inevitable. It's inherent in law because you apply general rules to individualized cases. And that is not by definition unfair, right? So, for example, the right to vote here in the Netherlands, you get the right to vote when you reach your 18th birthday. And of course, there is an assumption behind it that people under the age of 18 are not informed enough, smart enough, wise enough, mature enough to vote, and those over 18 are. Obviously, this is not true in all cases, right? There may be people over 18 who don't have a clue about politics, who don't care, who just vote for the nicest person, and there are people below the age of 18 who are really well up to date with politics. However, the fact that we draw a line somewhere is inevitable, I think, and in some sense, well, not unfair, right? So generalization in itself is inherent in law and inherent in running a society. Okay, let's move on to private law on the use of AI, because I tend to get carried away by this topic. Here we have the same issues with the GDPR, so I'll skip those. And for decision making, I mean, it's not clear at all that human rights apply between citizens horizontally, as we say. So even if Facebook removes my post because I'm violating their community rules, then I can complain that my freedom of expression is reduced because I'm not allowed to say what I want to say. But it's not at all clear that Facebook has an obligation to facilitate my freedom of expression. I mean, I can go somewhere else. Right? So horizontal effect of human rights is not, well, is not clear, is not self-evident. Now I need to put in my glasses. There are examples of what we call sound actuarial practices, non-spurious correlations. For example, think about the different, if you think about insurance, there is a difference when you think about risks. I live in a big city. I have a very expensive bicycle. I could have it insured, but the fee that I would need to pay, the insurance premium, to get my bicycle insured is much higher than would be the case if I lived somewhere in the country. Is that necessarily unfair? Am I discriminated then as being an inhabitant of a big city? But there is also, if we take insurance again as an example, what you pay for your car insurance. And if you are, a young guy in his early 20s, you're bound to be required to pay much more for your car insurance than when you are like I am, an old woman who, well, is supposed to drive safely. Is that unfair? Is that discrimination by gender? By age? And then, what if, again, insurance, the risk of unemployment? If you make a difference on ethnic origin, like if you are white and highly educated, your risk of becoming unemployed may be a lot less compared to when you are of a different skin color and a different ethnic origin. That is discrimination. But it's rather difficult to draw the line, and that is what, well, of course, anti-discrimination law is about. The same problems arise, for example, in credit scoring. I already gave the example of applying for a loan, but also in hiring. There are famous examples of resumes that are selected by artificial intelligence, and then, of course, there's also discrimination going on there, and marketing. But I don't have time to go into all of these very, very interesting examples. 3 minutes, yeah, I have to speed up, sorry. There is a blurred line, next slide, between public law and private law. There are public-private partnerships sharing data. There is the unclear status of some organization, and there is privatization of public services, like the train example that I just used. Next slide, speeding up. In law, we have the mechanism of liability as a means of enforcement, right? Because if you are liable, you have an incentive to make sure that the damage doesn't happen. For cases as like I have been talking about, when you take decisions using information technology, this liability mechanism doesn't always work satisfactorily because the damage is unclear and difficult to prove. We have intransparent algorithms, I've already talked about that. And if you don't know why your application for a loan was rejected, you cannot challenge it. And even if you could, there is always a high threshold for those affected to start with that. Okay, so what we do need, next slide, is awareness, education. We always need education. I'm a teacher, so please be educated. We need responsibility, accountability, and liability for decisions made with the help of AI or by AI. And we need effective remedies. We need empowerment of victims, and we need enforcement of existing rules. Final slide. At the end of the day, and this is the point that I want to make in my paper, in my view, but I'm not quite sure yet, it's not about AI at the end of the day, or even about technology. It is about the justice and fairness of applying general rules to individual cases. Even if the collection and processing of data, personal data, has changed significantly as a result of technological development. So it's old problems from legal theory that are cast in a new light. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk, and the floor is open for questions. Anna.
That's the question. Thank you, Tina, for a very nice presentation, very engaging, and also complementary to the talk before. I was wondering, is this what you're talking about? Is this applicable? It's Dutch law, maybe, but also European law. But how does this apply, for example, in the US or in other countries or continents? Is there a different approach, or is this more or less universal? Good question. In my paper, I will restrict. I will put a restriction to a European perspective, because that's all I know. But reading American sources, US sources, I think the problems are universal, right? So if law is applying general rules to individual cases, you cannot escape these problems of generalization. Now, it may well be that the sensitivities, also referring back to the previous speaker, the sensitivities may differ a bit locally, right? So I think in the US, maybe race is more of an issue than it is here, even if I'm not sure. And of course, the rules may differ, right? The GDPR is typically European, and in the US, they think about data protection in a rather different way, depending on which state we're talking about. And obviously, if you think about China, things are again different. So I think the problems are the same, but there may be different local legal systems and also different ethics. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you, Tina. I'm a colleague of Anna and Hans, and also Jaap. My name is Wendelin Tuip. And
can the audience hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. Interesting. Towards the end, you were a bit discussing about more what's needed is responsibility, accountability, and issues. I was wondering, and how should we or how would we have to go about that to achieve these goals?
Yeah. How to achieve responsibility, accountability, liability.
Yeah.
I think we need rules for that, and I think the rules are more or less in place for most of the examples that I talked about. And so if you are an official and you take a decision on something that say that, of course, you must motivate the decision. But the problem is enforcement. And the problem is always enforcement. Yeah, so it's not the case that we need more rules, but it is the case that we need transparency. And so as a citizen, you need to be aware of the fact that a decision was made concerning you, and you need to be able to challenge the decision. And in order for that, you need to know the reasons behind the decision.
Sure.
So no computer says no, but
And which party should be responsible then for guaranteeing this transparency?
yeah, the party taking the decision.
Okay, thank you very much again.